is time for a very special Two Women Talking. I am Leanna Kirstner here with Tomboy, here with Song W. Whitson, Girly Girl, but Song is author lady. This time we are doing a special spotlight on Song's book, Callatis Chronicles Volume 1. Callatis Chronicles is a collection of interconnected stories set in a historical fantasy setting. There's a lot of romance in it, but the Song has come to agree that it's more of a fantasy story. But today we're going to talk about the book by way of Song's thoughts on fantasy and romance. So we're going to dive in. Song, obviously, tell us about the book. It's out on Amazon now. Links in the description box below. Please buy it if you like what you hear. So what's Callatis Chronicles about, Song?
So Callatis is, I struggle summarizing it. It's an epic fantasy. I wanted to write a fantasy romance.
Right.
And I came to it with a very large cast of characters. But as I wrote it, I realized it's not just about the romance, because there is magic and there's gladiator fights too. Right. I feel like that's a pretty big selling point. But it chronicles the events it's the Republic of Cardea, but I named it after the capital city. And in volume 1, the social season is just starting, and it is centered around the celebration of the summer solstice. And so there is a ball, there is gladiator games, and there's a tournament, but that one doesn't happen on page as well. And it's all these characters who are coming back together as, like I said, the social season is starting, and it's reintroductions and it's people meeting. And of course, there is falling in love. Mm-hmm. Like I said, I wanted to write a fantasy romance, and then it got ahead of me, and I ended up writing an epic fantasy.
Yeah. And I mean, this is where we get into terminologies, and me as a, former English major, I start getting terms, because there is large R romantic literature, right? Like capital R period. Yes. It is definitely that. I mean, there's a big swack of epic fantasy, but there's definitely romanticism in it, in being dwarfed by events, the environment, and the emotions, and all our metaphors for each. Was that something you did intentionally, or was that because this sort of happened, this whole book, right?
Yeah. Not really. My writing tends to be a lot of happy accidents, I admit. Like, one of the themes that started coming through is the consequences of war, and like how it plays out and how it affects the people afterwards. And that was not planned. It just kept coming up. Really? Because several of the characters, many of them served in a war that happened 5 years earlier. So it's like they all have scars from that. And the city itself was sieged at one point. It doesn't get talked about much in volume 1. It is in the chapters of volume 2 that have already been serialized on my Ko-fi page. Kofi. But it's a city where it is scarred from the war. And like there are the physical scars of like roads, streets that were ripped up by magic as well as war.
Oh, cool. And tank treads. That's awesome.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But so instead of just covering it up, they turned it into art. So it's like places where cobblestones got ripped up, they're now mosaics and colorful stones. And you have a memorial fountain in the town circle for certain characters who they're connected to the story.
Right.
And namely, it's moving on after the war, although, well, I won't spoil anything. Right. I have this series planned, and it's big. It's like we're at volume 1, but like there are a lot of plans for the future. But I won't spoil them.
Right.
So
Now, I mean, for me, I like historical fiction. I'm making no
Mhm.
secret of my love for, the first Captain America movie.
Yes.
And war and the after effects of war and romance. I think the less toxic forms of romance are really inextricably tied, because you don't get many other ways where, one, the events of the world are so big that people find comfort in each other, but also people make more sudden decisions because, hey, we could all be dead tomorrow, right?
Yes.
And so I don't know of many other backdrops that can actually tell some of these getting carried away stories responsibly. Was that something you were thinking? Because I know this is something we share a lot in common in terms of viewpoint on.
Not at all,
Okay.
really. I talk a lot about planning, but at the same time, there's a lot of the story that it all just kind of worked out, where
Hmm.
like certain characters showed up on the page, and then I'm like, oh, wait, you would be a great antagonist.
Really? You
And
didn't plan the antagonist, it's so this person's well suited.
oh, so there's one character in the Black Rose,
Hmm.
which is the first story.
Yeah.
He was absolutely planned. Um,
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say he
no,
seems very central casting
no,
antagonist.
no, Caspian was
Yeah.
absolutely set up from the beginning to
Okay.
be an antagonist. But
Yeah.
when you get to the ball, there's a political character. I don't think he actually existed until he walked onto the page. And it
Interesting.
was like, oh, this one character needs a father-in-law. And then
Ah,
as I was writing it, I was like, oh no, 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 wait. He's the central for the political struggles that
okay.
are coming up. And I worry I make this sound like it's all chaotic and I'm throwing things together. It's not that.
Right.
um
No, you really went through it and went through it and went through it. I watched you agonize. So I actually like the fact that so much of this was organic.
yeah.
I think that too often we live in a very overeducated age, and it takes away some of the enjoyment of seeing an artist, a creator, be vulnerable and just say, this is what I liked, so I made it, you know?
Pretty yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was the author Charles DeLint who said, if there's a book you want to read, but you're not finding it on the bookshelves, write it yourself.
Mhm.
Which, as a reader, I'm like, but I don't want to write it. I just want to read it.
Right.
But at
Right.
the same time, it's like, I've talked about in Two Women Talking that it's like my favorite authors are Jane Austen and Robert E. Howard.
Mhm.
And those are two pretty different aspects of things. It's Jane Austen, Regency England versus Conan the Barbarian. And so,
And yet there is still world building. There is still there are overlap.
mhm,
People would have to do a much deeper dive than most people do to see it.
mhm.
And good
And
writing is good writing.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
no. And it's so it was taking that kind of the society aspect of Jane Austen, which has
Hmm.
always fascinated me. And I love that the interplay of how your relationships, how relationships in the upper classes especially can affect things,
Hmm.
and how the politics you hold and your family's rank and how it all interplays, which is how you get a lot of the upper class stories, because there is
Right.
a mix of, you have the characters who are the ruling families. This is a republic, so there's 14 ruling families who have a council, and then there's the council of prefects beneath them, because
Hmm.
there is so much ancient Rome in this story.
Hmm.
um, the premise for the world building is, and I'm sorry if I'm all over the place, the premise for the world building was kind of, what if the fall of Rome happened, but the Dark Age didn't?
Okay. That's a good way of
Um,
putting it. Yeah.
yeah, so part of my family is Welsh, And I remember not long before my grandfather died, actually, he was telling me, oh, yeah, well, we probably have Roman ancestry
Yeah.
on that side of the family because when Rome fell,
Mm-hmm.
a bunch of the Roman governors and people who were there, they stayed because they were like, I don't know, why am I going to go back?
Right.
And so I was running with the idea of what if Rome fell, but there was still enough of the influence in particularly Great Britain and Ireland and Wales
Mm-hmm.
that they said, okay, well, they're gone, but we can build our own democracy from,
Right.
well, it's not a democracy. But we can build our own society. So instead of falling into the Dark Age and the wars and the barbarism that came from the fall of Rome, they just kept building in
Mm-hmm.
way. And the remaining tribes were like, cool, you taught us how to run a government and how to build these beautiful
Mm-hmm.
architectural marvels. We can do this now.
Yeah.
And, and of course we have magic, which I can justify pretty much any historical inaccuracies in this story with there is magic.
Right, right. Okay. Now we're getting into the history versus fantasy and certain authors justifying what's going on the inside of their heads by saying, well, it was history when it was not. And I know you're really big on, you enjoy history. You're a student of
I do.
history. And you love your barbarians.
Yeah.
Now, the barbarian trope is something that fascinates me because it's moved from a pejorative, a propaganda tactic to scare local populations with outsiders to a trope that makes women swoon, right?
Yes.
And I'm sure you're aware of this and you love the trope. So
Yes,
how
I
do
do.
you use it? Because there's some parts that, based on what I knew of your love of barbarians, I didn't expect you to get real the way you did in some things that are kind of gross and historically accurate.
I assume you're referring to the Gladiator sweat perfume.
That, but also some of them are brutes, but they
Yes.
aren't all brutes. They can adapt. They're not idiots. They're somebody who does a particular kind of job.
Yes. Well, I mean, back to my love for Robert E. Howard
Mm-hmm.
and Conan. We call him Conan the Barbarian now, but that wasn't what Howard called him. It was Conan the Cimmerian,
Right.
who came from the savage north. And especially people who haven't actually read the stories that Howard wrote, they tend to think of the Schwarzenegger Conan,
Right.
who can't read, who can barely speak. But Conan, as Howard wrote him, was always very intelligent.
Right.
There was a point where when he first came into the city, it was about 19 when he first came down from Samaria into the more civilized countries of the South. And he spent 3 days sitting in the temples and listening to the philosophers talk. And I'm always every time I think I'm reminded of in the Bible where Jesus was in the temple and Mary and Joseph couldn't find him at first and they came in. But it's a contrast because Conan sat there for 3 days listening to them and then said, oh, they're all idiots.
Mm-hmm.
And they're all
Yeah.
just, it's hot air philosophy. They don't know what they're talking about, which is something I always enjoyed because they're a lot of people who talk philosophically and intellectually. I'm just like, you must like the sound of your own voice. That's the only reason why
That's
imagine,
interesting.
I think you keep talking because what you're saying is gobbledygook.
That's very interesting because yeah, when I came out of university, we have all the language, what they call
Mm-hmm.
the ish now,
Yes.
right? And people think that makes you sound smart. It doesn't. It just makes you sound pompous
And
and
pretentious.
pretentious. And that's something I find interesting about the way the barbarian um, trope has evolved, because one of the stories I like least in the story in the book of stories behind stories is the story of how Frankenstein was written that rainy summer in the villa in Italy with Lord Byron and Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley and John Polidori. Because I think Byron and Shelley come off as a couple of asshole homoerotic fuckwits, who wouldn't let anybody talk and just blah, blah, blah. And I don't know, because then my inner Austen starts kicking in, and was Mary Shelley like diss tracking those dudes with that story? Is that story intended to make them look bad? Because I mean, let's face it, Byron is well known because he got a trope named after him. He was such an asshole. But the most famous, the most enduring story from that whole summer is Frankenstein. So what do you think about that story and sort of the role? Because the term barbarian, the reason I'm talking about this is because best we can tell, it's a Greek term that was just about the fact that they spoke another language. And so to the Greeks, it just sounded like they were grunting. Do you have the same understanding?
Believe so. In the Victorian era, there was a lot of the misconceptions we have about Vikings now comes from the Victorian era. And this idea that in order for anyone to have threatened them, England in particular, it was, oh, well, they must have been these extreme savages.
Right.
And just these violent brutes if they could have bested us. No, these were the people who scandalized Europe once a week. And there was actually a big issue of them seducing, not carrying women off, actually seducing women because they were clean and they were well groomed. One of all the Viking artifacts we have today, just of lifestyle stuff, the one there is the most of is combs. Because these people, they combed their hair, the men combed their beards. They were very neat.
That's an interesting thing, right? It's one of these points of history that tends to get neglected, is when somebody came along and did something better than the locals, they just demonized them instead of going, hey, maybe we better up our game. Yeah. And so how does that inform your stories, that awareness? Because let's face it, you're smarter than the average author, frankly, but you're also, I mean, the fact that you choose to write romance when you could do other things, and that makes that's treating the genre like it's lesser, but let's face it, it is. There are certain genres that are seen as less intellectual than others, and romance is inherently focused on feelings, and therefore it gets dismissed. So,
well, there's plenty I could say about that.
Yeah.
But there's in the story, there's a North and South divide, of course, this small republic, but you have the northern families who they were essentially the Vikings before. It's a mix of Norse, Scottish, and Irish coding, essentially. And there's a point where one of the northern women, Runa, is talking to one of the gladiators he's actually from even further north than she is. And she says, I'm a northern lady. There's lowered expectations for me. And it's essentially saying, the Southerners, and technically her mother is Southern, but that hasn't even come up yet. That's a whole.
And for people who don't know the character, underestimate Runa at your own peril. She's very canny.
Yes.
Yeah.
Runa was originally supposed to be my Disney princess, but she turned into he ended up being my manifestation feminine rage, honestly. where
I can see that track. Yeah.
So she hasn't fully gotten to utilize it yet.
But she does kind of sit back and go, you're an asshole. Yeah.
Well, there's 2 points where it's essentially she is behaving because a friend asked her to.
Yes.
And she is putting up with specifically male attention she does not want because her friend asked her to play nice.
Right.
But at the same, when she gives this friend a look and she's like, this is your fault. Mm-hmm. You better get over here and fix this. He does. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, Richard is not one of those characters who likes to do what anyone tells him because he's the head of a family and he controls everyone. You know, that's part of Richard and his whole family in their arc is he keeps everyone on leash when he can. Mm-hmm. There's one exception.
Right.
But it's again, it comes to all these things that it's like, so that one exception I mentioned has been name dropped and he's been talked about in volume, but so much of it comes in later. So there's characters, and that's the fun thing about coming in with a huge cast that's already developed. Yeah. Is it's like I can start name dropping and force people, and there's the one I've name dropped most. Hammond's aunt, Dusana, and she's one of those characters I'm so excited to bring in because she's the witch in the woods, essentially, but she's still a ways off,
right? So,
but yeah, I realized she's the one who's been name dropped most because many of her nieces and nephews who are like, yeah, Aunt Dusana said this and Aunt Dusana told me that, so yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, you're getting on something that is a thing in both fantasy and I mean, Austen drilled down on this. Jane Austen is not romance fiction. Jane Austen is social commentary.
It really is. And like I've had people say, oh, she's romance, and when I try to push back, they're like, no, but the romance is the main point of the story. And I'm like,
it's not.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
It's
the reason it's romantic is that it's tight social confines and two people find an element of freedom in relationships.
Yeah. And so much of the romance genre now, people trying to be Austen. That's why romance is such a huge part of the genre. Not so much now. I think the Viking fad is done.
You do?
Well, I mean, we went from the Scots to the Vikings, and I think the Vikings have started to play out. It'll never go away entirely.
Okay, I admit there's been so much, and I as somebody with obvious Scottish background and the fact that it's like, okay, this is someone's culture, not your theme park. And so now I talk to my friends who are legit Norse, like they're in Norway, and I'm like, you're turning the barrel, man. Like people are treating your culture, your history, your religion as their sandbox, and
specifically their fetish sandbox.
Their fetish sandbox. Yeah, I mean, can you imagine being a Norse person and seeing white supremacist groups call themselves the Sons of Odin?
Oh,
like,
God.
Talk about a pluralistic, inclusive society becoming synonymous with white supremacy. It's so ignorant. And you do some interesting things in the stories where you do little historical points that I guess now that I'm thinking about it, it's that nod to the fact that the local women like these guys. And made the local men really uncomfortable. And the women are kind of, I don't want to say something that's a judgment or a pejorative here because it's not, but the women are willful and they're almost kind of wild the way they're openly lusting after these gladiators.
Okay, so I should clarify one of the girls you're referring to, Adis, is like Runa. She's specifically northern,
Right.
but she's also not from a ruling family, so she's more wild.
Right. And wild makes it sound bad, right?
Well, there is also
there's all this commerce built up around. Sorry, we're having some connection issues here. There's all this commerce built up around women's lust for the gladiators, and I find it so refreshing, right?
Okay,
you went for it.
So part of it is, it's like, yes, I see what you're saying about the Scots and the Norse and how that can be uncomfortable for people seeing all the romance novels about it. The thing is, I wish I could like those books. I wish they were better written.
Yeah.
Because I love the barbarian type. I named myself after the strongest, most brutish characters in How to Train Your Dragon.
Right.
And we've talked about this before. So it's like, it was very much my type, and I didn't see anyone doing it well. And, but I mean, part of why the gladiators are a thing in this is because my best friend basically said, how sexy could you make a gladiator fight?
Okay.
And I said, pretty darn sexy.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Okay.
And so and going with the historical accuracy of the gladiators in Rome were sports stars.
Yes.
Now, I'm not dealing with the slavery aspect of gladiators because I wanted to create a world where a lot of the social issues we have now aren't an issue.
That's refreshing.
And that's one of the advantages of having magic, is like birth control is a readily available option. So are free to do what they want. And it's very freeing. There's also no Christianity.
Right. And that, I mean, I think one of the things that frustrates me in the fantasy space is people have all these options and they keep doing the same 6 cultures.
And I mean, I'm using Western Europe and Rome, so it's like I can't say I'm especially original in that aspect.
Okay, but in fairness, you can't these days borrow from other cultures. There's a stink on it. But I like the way you threaded the needle, because you don't have to, you can choose to make a world where things like slavery are not a force, so to speak, because it is an escape from our world and the shittiness of it.
And that was the big thing, is it's like, I want a fantasy I can enjoy.
Right.
And I want fantasy that is about the emotions and the characters and the subtle interplays of relationship, but I want it on an epic scale. And I want that big fantasy story. And so, as the quote goes, I wrote what I wanted to read. Yeah, like I said, ancient Rome is a big part, because, like I said, what if Rome fell, but we didn't have the Dark Age?
Right.
And just also, there are Eastern Asian elements as well. And some of them do show up in volume 1, but that was the most stressful part to write, because oh God, please don't let me mess this up.
I remember when you were worried about that. Yeah.
And I've kind of just been like, okay, it's so ingrained in the story and what's to come at this point that's like, I can't do anything. So we're just going to have to live with it.
And again, it's fantasy. It's not saying anything about any real culture. You borrowed a flavor.
Yes.
Because it worked for the story. And I think that people need to chill about not putting things where they don't belong in terms of criticism. This is a story that's intended, it's deliberately escapist, right? Like you said, the challenge was make a gladiator fight as sexy as you possibly can. And there's a purity to that I really appreciate, because I'm so sick of I'll come out and say it, like Western creators. The Japanese don't do this. You know, you read the creator of Attack on Titan, and there's a ton of military themes and stuff like that in that story. But it's like I grew up in a small town. I always wondered what was beyond the wall, you know, and now, you know, one day I left, and that sort of inspired it. It's so simple, and obviously there's more to it than that, but that's all he wanted to share. And so go ahead.
There also, you know, write what you know. And it's
Sure.
and this is probably a I could use for a regular two women talking. But the thing I've discovered is a lot of people tend to misinterpret or disingenuously represent write what you know as, oh, well, you can only write about a culture you know, or you can only write about a deliberate experience you've had.
Right.
But that's not what it is.
You're right.
So, yeah, it's like I had an experience where I was hurt very badly. And then a few years later, I was writing a fan fiction, and I was writing a character with a broken heart. And my situation was completely different, but it's like I still knew what a broken heart felt like.
Yeah, you could connect to the emotions.
Yes. So it was extremely viscerally written. And again, this was fan fiction, so it was very popular.
Okay.
And people really enjoyed it. And it's like, you know, at least I was able to take my pain and turn it into something, turn it into art. And there is that kind of, you know, I forget what it's called, that Japanese art of taking broken pottery and using gold to put it back together. It's key something, but I'm not even going to try to say it.
Yeah, but I mean, you're taking pain and turning it into something enjoyable, and I think that's very healing.
Yeah. And I mean, that going back to what I said about how the city has been ripped up by war, but they said, okay, let's make art out of it. And like that was part of the inspiration. And again, you know, write what you know. That's kind of my philosophy on life, I suppose, is taking something rough and, okay, how can we use this in a way that's productive and maybe even make it beautiful?
Okay, anything else you want people to know about the story? I don't want to overtalk it too much, because I want people to, if you guys think Song has made a good point anywhere here, don't worry about me, her. Get the book. Seriously, this is the point we're doing this. This is your opportunity, fans of Two Women Talking, to support Song and her endeavors in a meaningful way. So seriously, get the book. But is there anything else you think people should know, or that you want them to know? Like going in, this is obviously important to you. What do you want people to take from it?
You know, I've been writing for 20 years, essentially. And again, it's a story I want to read. It's taking everything I love about fantasy and romance and putting it into a story that I mean, you were the one who said this isn't a fantasy romance, this is a fantasy epic.
Yeah.
And it's like, so I hope I don't sound like I'm just saying it. It is epic. And I'm really proud of what I've created. And, you know, I was inspired by Austen and Tolkien and the old pulps, which is why the story is set up the way it is.
Okay, that makes sense. All right.
Yeah. Well, I started out serializing it on my Ko-fi page. And like I said, I've already started serializing volume 2. So technically all that is free to read on Ko-fi.
I mean, I really like the way you're introduced to one character in one story, and then they're in another story in a completely different way. I mean, the character Hammond, who is my hands down favorite, and I did not expect that going in. But then, you know, we talked, I said to Song, but of course he's a bookish sorcerer. You know, that's my type. But the way he has, because of his station, because of his role in society, there's so many ways to put him places that make sense, you know, because he's his role as a role as a sorcerer in one, but then it's, you know, the status of his family in another. And then, you know, he gets to be a man too. I love the fact the sorcerer isn't the villain. He's not the old guy that doesn't understand the young warrior. I'm so sick of that, you know?
No, and I will just say, you know, Hammond's biggest struggle is his family, because I talked about, you know, the northern families have that bit of a barbarian side. His family is the worst about it. And he is an exception in his family.
Yeah.
And his sister and his cousin are pretty much, well, his cousin mainly is one of the biggest sources of scandal in this first volume, essentially. And he's one of the main barbarian types. So, you know, we've mentioned in a previous Two Women Talking of the barbarian cleaning up to go to the ball, essentially. And that's Hammond's cousin Hrothgar.
And I like the fact that he actually was able to navigate it, that everybody was sort of scandalized and turned up their nose, but he's not a dummy. He's just an outsider, right? Not even because of the northern integration, but I like that, you know, because one of the things I say a lot is there's no such thing as a bad trope. There is such thing as a trope badly used, right?
Yeah.
And I really think one of the things that's so cool about this story is, you know, the difference. Yeah.
And that's the thing. A trope is a starting point. So like I can say, oh, Hrothgar is a barbarian type, but that doesn't explain Hrothgar. Like I would have to go on into the family history and how he became who he and that's one of the reasons why I like epic fantasy, is because it's like, if you really want to understand a character, okay, what were his parents like? What was his childhood like? And that's something I get to delve into in epic fantasy, is these generations and the interplay and how they all affect each other.
And you guys can too, if you pick up Callatis Chronicles on Amazon. I'm going to promote the crap out of this because I think people should read it. But also I think people should support creators they enjoy. And you guys have listened to Song a lot on Two Women Talking. And I think that now's the time the community can support you and get a really entertaining experience as well. I mean, it's legitimately good. I'm enjoying the crap out of it. So how can people find it? Do they just search Callatis Chronicles and Song W. Erickson on Amazon?
Yes, that should bring it up. I'll also have links on all my social media. You can find me on Twitter at Song W. Erickson. I can also give you my Linktree link, and that will have links to all my stuff.
That's probably the easiest thing, because check it out, guys. Check it out. Do your part. Adventures assemble and all that stuff. Autobots roll out. I'm getting really cliche, but seriously, check out the book, Song. I'm pulling for it. You did a great job. I know you put a ton of work into this, so congratulations for finally getting it out.
Thank you. Yes, like I said, I've been writing for more than 20 years, and like obviously getting a book out has been a goal. So this is huge. This is